At a family meeting, my parents demanded my $700,000 inheritance to pay off my brother's gambling debt. I stepped into my parents' house in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, the kind of place where brick row houses line the streets, and everyone knows the best deep dish pizza joint by heart. It was a Sunday afternoon in late spring, the air heavy with the smell of blooming lilacs from their tiny front yard. My mother, Carol, had called it a family meeting, which already felt off. We never did those growing up. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, just casual dinners where we'd argue over who got the last slice of Lou Malnati's. So when I walked through the door, my stomach churned with this uneasy mix of curiosity and dread, like I was stepping into a room I didn't belong in. The living room was the same as ever. A worn leather couch, a coffee table cluttered with old magazines, and a framed photo of me and my brother Ethan at Six Flags when we were kids, both of us grinning with cotton candy stuck to our faces. My father, William, was at the dining table, pouring bourbon into a glass. Maker's Mark, his go-to since I was a teenager, probably $30 at the local Binny's. He's a retired high school math teacher, always in flannel shirts, even in May, and he had this habit of rubbing his glasses with his sleeve when he was nervous. He was doing that now, avoiding my eyes. Mom was fussing in the kitchen, setting out a tray of tortilla chips and store-bought guacamole, the kind she'd buy from Whole Foods down the street for $10. She's a part-time real estate agent, always in flowy blouses and gold hoop earrings, her hair dyed a shade too blonde to cover the gray. She smiled at me, but it was tight, like she was trying to sell me a condo. "Sophie, honey, sit down," she said, her voice too bright. I sat, clutching my purse, a cheap leather one I got on sale in New York, where I've lived for 5 years now, scraping by as a marketing coordinator. My brother Ethan showed up 20 minutes late, his sneakers scuffing the hardwood floor. He's 28, 2 years younger than me, but looked older that day. Eyes bloodshot, hands twitching like he hadn't slept in days. He works odd jobs, last I heard, as a bartender in Wrigleyville, but he's never held one for long. He slumped into a chair, not saying hi, just staring at the table. I noticed his jacket, a beat-up denim thing he's worn since high school, and felt this weird pang of pity mixed with irritation. I wanted to ask if he was okay, but something in his silence told me not to. Mom cleared her throat like she was about to give a speech at one of her open houses. Dad kept quiet, polishing his glasses again. Then she said it, her voice steady but careful, like she'd rehearsed. "Sophie, your brother's in some trouble. We think it's best to use your inheritance to help him out. Not can we talk about it, or would you consider? Just use. Like my money was already theirs." That hit me like a punch I saw coming. My grandfather's estate lawyer had called me 2 months earlier about the $700,000 left to me, set to release on my 30th birthday in June. It was a lot, more than I'd ever imagined, because Grandpa had invested in tech stocks years ago, and after taxes it came out to that. He left it to me, not Ethan, not my parents, because I'd spent summers with him in Evanston, listening to his stories about coding in the 80s, helping with his garden. I loved him, and that money felt like his last gift, a chance to finally breathe. But here they were, demanding it for Ethan's gambling debts. Mom went on saying he owed $200,000 to some dangerous people from his trips to Las Vegas. I later learned from the lawyer it was from casino markers. Unsecured loans with brutal interest, 20 to 30% a year, piling up over 4 years of bad bets. It wasn't just a one-time mess. Ethan had been spiraling for years. I stared at Mom, her eyes pleading but also hard, like she truly believed this was my job to fix. Dad just sipped his bourbon, his silence louder than words. I didn't say anything. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw the guacamole tray and ask why they always picked Ethan over me. But another part, the part that spent years swallowing hurt, kept still, watching. I felt angry, sure, but also this strange sadness, like I was mourning a family I'd never really had. Mom and Dad weren't monsters. They loved Ethan, maybe too much, and I think they were scared. scared of losing him, scared of those bad guys showing up at their door. I got that, but it didn't make it right. I nodded slowly, my fingers tight around my purse strap. "Okay," I said, voice flat. "Let me think about it." Mom's face softened, like she'd won. Dad finally looked at me, his eyes tired but relieved. Ethan just kept staring at the table, like he wasn't even there. I stood up, said I had a train to catch back to New York, and left. But I wasn't going to think about it. I already knew what I had to do. As I sat there in that Lincoln Park living room, listening to my mom explain how using my inheritance was the only way to save Ethan, my mind drifted back to all the times this family had let me down. It wasn't just one thing, it was a pattern, built up over years, and it made their demand feel less like a shock and more like an inevitability. I felt this knot in my chest. Anger, yeah, but also a tired kind of resignation, like I'd been waiting for this shoe to drop. It started when I was getting ready for college. My parents had set up a 529 plan for me when I was little, the kind a lot of middle-class families in Chicago do to save on taxes. By the time I was 18, it had about $35,000 in it, money from birthdays and odd jobs Grandpa threw in over the years. I was excited, planning to go to DePaul University downtown, study marketing, maybe get an internship at one of those ad agencies in the Loop. But then Ethan, who was 16 at the time, crashed his old Honda Civic joyriding with friends. Instead of making him pay for it or get a job, Mom and Dad decided to dip into my college fund to buy him a new SUV, a Ford Explorer, $45,000 after taxes and fees at the dealership in Skokie. They said it was because he needed reliable wheels to get to his part-time gig at a bar near Wrigley Field, but I knew it was more than that. Ethan was their baby, the one who could do no wrong, and they were scared he'd drop out of high school if things got too hard. Dad even admitted later that he felt guilty for not being around more when we were kids, working long hours as a teacher. So they borrowed from my future to fix his present. I ended up at a community college instead, commuting on the L train and worked nights at a coffee shop to cover books. That coffee shop job was my first real taste of independence. I started at 15, slinging lattes at a Starbucks in Lincoln Park, making about $10 an hour back then, plus tips. Over 2 years, I saved up $8,000 in a simple savings account at Chase Bank down the street, the kind with a debit card and no fancy interest. It was my money, from wiping counters and dealing with cranky morning commuters who wanted their venti, non-fat whatever. I dreamed of using it for a study abroad trip or maybe a down payment on a car of my own. But when Ethan got into trouble again, this time with some credit card debt from online sports betting, Mom asked to borrow from my account. She said it was temporary, that they'd pay it back, but they never did. Looking back, I think Mom was torn. She's always been the fixer in the family, showing houses to clients and making everything look perfect. But at home, she couldn't admit Ethan had a problem. It was easier to take from me because I was the responsible one, the one who wouldn't make a fuss. Then there was the phone incident. A few years later, when I was 22 and finally transferring to a 4-year school, Ethan sold my iPhone, a new one I'd bought for $800 with my own money, to fund a poker trip to Las Vegas. He said he needed the cash for entry fees, but really it was to chase some big win that never came. Mom covered for him, saying he'd found the money elsewhere, but I knew. She even replaced it with a cheap Android, acting like it was no big deal. Ethan apologized once, mumbling something about being stressed from bartending shifts during Cubs games, where the crowds got rowdy and tips were good but inconsistent. I forgave him then, because he's my brother, and part of me still saw the kid who used to build forts with me in the backyard. But it hurt, and that hurt built up. All this came rushing back as Dad finally spoke up in the meeting, his voice low. He owes some bad people, Sophie. They could come after him, or us. I almost laughed, but it caught in my throat as a bitter lump, because when I was 20, right after starting that community college, I had a breakdown. burnout from juggling classes and 2 jobs, plus the stress of commuting on the crowded Red Line every day. I needed a place to stay closer to school, but rent for even a basic 1-bedroom in Chicago back in 2015 was around $1,800 a month, way more than I could afford on my barista wages. I asked my parents if I could move back home for a bit just to get on my feet. They said no, told me to tough it out, that I was an adult now. Dad said it with this reluctant tone, like he knew it was harsh, but thought it would build character, the way his own parents had done to him. Mom just nodded, probably worried about the house feeling crowded again. A year or so later, when I'd moved to New York for an entry-level marketing job paying about $50,000 a year, decent for 2016 but barely enough after taxes, I hit another wall. Couldn't make the rent on my tiny shared apartment in Brooklyn, which was $2,500 a month split with roommates. Again, I called home, hoping for a small loan or even just advice. Figure it out, they said. You're strong. Strong. That word stung. Ethan wouldn't look at me during the meeting, just tapped his fingers on the table, like he was counting cards in his head. This was his 4th bailout, and I could see the shame in his slumped shoulders, but also this quiet expectation that I'd cave. They kept talking after Dad mentioned those bad people, laying out the plan like it was a family budget meeting. Mom pulled out a notepad, the kind she uses for listing open houses, with scribbled numbers, explaining how we'd only need to use a chunk of the inheritance, maybe $200,000 to cover Ethan's debts. That included the principal from his casino markers in Las Vegas, plus the interest, which had climbed to about $50,000 a year at those high rates loan sharks charge. She said we could liquidate some stocks from Grandpa's portfolio. He had invested in things like Apple and index funds over the years. So about $400,000 was in stocks and the rest, $300,000 in cash after estate fees and taxes. It sounded practical, the way Mom always makes things sound when she's showing a fixer-upper to clients, highlighting the potential while downplaying the cracks. Dad nodded along, his bourbon glass half empty now, and I could see he was uncomfortable, shifting in his chair like he did during parent-teacher conferences back when he was still teaching. He wasn't pushing hard. I think part of him knew this was wrong, that taking from me to fix Ethan again was just kicking the can down the road. But he loved Ethan, maybe in a way he never quite figured out how to show me. Always quicker to bail him out because Ethan reminded him of his own wild younger days, betting on horses at Arlington Park before it closed. Mom glanced at him for support, her hoop earrings catching the light from the window overlooking the neighbor's backyard barbecue, the smell of grilling burgers drifting in. Ethan still wouldn't meet my eyes, just kept tapping his fingers on the table, a rhythm like he was practicing for a bar shift or maybe replaying a poker hand in his head. I felt this mix of frustration and sorrow looking at him. He wasn't a bad guy deep down, just lost, chasing highs from those Vegas trips where he'd blow tips from busy Cubs nights, sometimes a couple $100 in one evening when the team was winning. But his silence grated on me, like he expected me to step up without him even asking. Inside, I almost smiled. Not out of joy, but this ironic twist in my gut. Here they were, painting themselves as fragile, worried about collectors knocking on their Lincoln Park door when they'd left me to fend for myself so many times. I remembered scraping by in New York, my first apartment a cramped studio in Brooklyn's Bushwick neighborhood, with exposed brick walls that looked cool but let in drafts, rent at $2,500 a month in 2025 prices, eating ramen to make ends meet on my $60,000 salary coordinating social media campaigns for a small agency. The work was okay, posting about trendy cafes and events, but the stress built up, and when I'd called home for help, they brushed it off. Now their vulnerability felt convenient, and that made me angry, but also a little guilty, like maybe I was being too harsh. I didn't interrupt. I let them wrap up, Mom saying it wasn't like I was using the money yet, her voice softening as if to appeal to some sisterly bond. That stung. My dreams of maybe buying a small place in New York or traveling didn't count, but I kept my face neutral, nodding. "I'll think it over," I said for the second time, my voice steadier than I felt. They seemed relieved. Dad poured another splash of bourbon. Mom touched my arm gently, like we were close the way we used to be during family trips to the Shed Aquarium as kids. What they didn't know was that right before driving over from the airport I'd flown in from LaGuardia that morning, I checked my email in the cab. The confirmation from the lawyer was there. The irrevocable trust was fully set up. In simple terms, it's like putting the money in a safe that only I can open. Under U.S. law, once it's irrevocable, family or creditors can't touch it without my approval, and any attempt to transfer without my signature would alert the bank and the lawyer right away, stopping fraud in its tracks. Grandpa's estate was handled in Illinois, so the trust followed those rules, protecting the full $700,000. I felt a quiet strength from that, but also a pang of sadness that I even needed it against my own family. As I left the house, the Chicago streets buzzing with people heading to afternoon games or parks, I wondered if things could have been different, but deep down I knew this was the line I had to draw. A few days passed after that meeting in Chicago, and I was back in my New York routine, trying to focus on work. My office is in Midtown Manhattan, a bustling co-working space with exposed ceilings and communal kitchens where everyone microwaves their lunches. Mine usually a salad from the deli downstairs for about $15. As a marketing coordinator, I spend my days scheduling posts for clients, like promoting local events in Brooklyn or cafes in Queens, earning around $60,000 a year after taxes, which barely covers my $2,500 rent for the Bushwick studio. It's a small place, with a Murphy bed that folds into the wall and a view of the J train rumbling by, but it's mine, a far cry from the shared house I grew up in. I waited, half expecting a follow-up text or call, but also hoping they'd drop it. Then Mom rang on Wednesday evening, her voice cheerful like she was checking in about the weather. "Sophie, honey, I've started the paperwork for the transfer," she said. I was sitting on my couch, a secondhand IKEA thing I'd lugged up 3 flights, with a cup of tea, and her words made my stomach drop. I took a breath and said, "There's nothing to start, Mom." Silence on the line, the kind that stretches and makes your heart pound. I explained the trust then, keeping it simple. It's irrevocable, meaning once the money's in there, no one can touch it without my say-so. Under the laws handling Grandpa's estate in Illinois, it's protected from family claims or outside pressures, like a safety net I set up myself. Any try to move funds would ping alerts to the bank and my lawyer, stopping it cold. She went quiet for a moment, then whispered, "But we're your parents." Her tone had this hurt edge, like I'd betrayed some unspoken rule. I get it now. She wasn't just demanding. She was scared, thinking this was the only way to keep Ethan safe, to hold the family together the way she always tried with holiday dinners at Navy Pier or summer barbecues in the backyard. But in that moment, it felt manipulative, and I shot back, "And I'm not your bank." We hung up, and I sat there staring at my tea, feeling a rush of empowerment mixed with this nagging doubt. Am I being too cold? Should I have offered something smaller? Dad showed up at my apartment that night, unannounced. I'd just finished a late work email when the buzzer rang. He must have taken the first flight from O'Hare, his face red and sweaty as he stood in my narrow hallway, still in his flannel shirt smelling faintly of bourbon. "Sophie, you're tearing this family apart," he said, his voice rising, slurring a bit from the stress or maybe a drink on the plane. He accused me of letting Ethan get hurt, that those debts could lead to real danger. I stood my ground saying, "Then let him face it. Actions have consequences." It came out sharper than I meant, but I was tired of the cycle. Dad wasn't yelling out of pure anger. I saw the fear in his eyes, the same look he had when Ethan first got into trouble years ago, like he blamed himself for not being stricter. He slammed his fist on the doorframe, not hard enough to break anything, but a picture of me at graduation fell to the floor with a clatter. Then he left, muttering about how I'd changed. The next morning, as I was grabbing coffee from the bodega on my corner, strong black for $2, I got a call from the casino's legal team in Las Vegas. Someone had tried using my name to settle a debt agreement, floating it as collateral or something. It was straight-up fraud, identity theft under federal rules, where people misuse your info for financial gain. I didn't hesitate. I filed a police report that hour, calling the non-emergency line for the NYPD and submitting details online through their portal, as the FTC recommends for these cases. It traced back to Ethan. He'd probably panicked and forged something simple, thinking it would buy time. The report was to protect my credit and stop any escalation, not to drag him through court. I didn't want that drama, just boundaries. After that, things went quiet. No more calls from Mom or Dad, no texts from Ethan begging, just silence. And honestly, it felt like peace for the first time in years. But it wasn't pure relief. There was this undercurrent of sadness, wondering if I'd lost them for good, even as I knew it was necessary. The silence stretched on after I filed that police report, and it was both a relief and a weight. No more calls from Mom trying to smooth things over with her real estate charm. No visits from Dad with his quiet regrets. Ethan didn't reach out either, which hurt in a way I didn't expect. He's my brother, after all, the one who used to sneak me snacks during family movie nights watching old Cubs games on replay. But the quiet let me breathe. Let me focus on my days in New York without that constant pull back to Chicago. I still got the occasional text, though, things like, "You're being selfish" from Mom, or "You've changed" from Dad, popping up on my phone while I was at work, scrolling through client emails in the co-working space with its buzzing fluorescent lights and shared printers that always jammed. Those messages stung, making me second-guess myself late at night in my Bushwick studio, lying on the Murphy bed listening to the train outside. Was I selfish? Part of me wondered if helping Ethan one more time could have fixed things, kept the family whole. But then I'd remember the patterns, the way they'd enabled him out of love, sure, but also fear of facing his issues head on, like getting him real help for the gambling instead of quick fixes. They weren't villains. They were just human, stuck in their ways, and that made the hurt more complicated. A month later, I decided to use a small piece of the trust, not to run away, but to remind myself what living felt like. I booked a trip to Miami flying first class from JFK, which cost about $800 round trip on American Airlines, a splurge compared to my usual economy seats. The hotel was a mid-range spot on South Beach, 5 nights at $300 each, with a balcony overlooking the ocean where tourists strolled in flip-flops and the air smelled of salt and sunscreen. I spent around $700 on meals, fresh seafood at casual spots like Joe's Stone Crab, a Miami staple, and Cuban sandwiches from street vendors, plus some shopping for a new swimsuit. Total came to about $3,000, just a sliver of the $700,000, but it felt earned. A nod to the self-care trends my marketing job promoted, but I rarely practiced. In Miami, walking the Art Deco streets with their pastel buildings and palm trees swaying, I finally felt free. No guilt hanging over me like Chicago's winter clouds, just sun and space to think. I realized I'd changed, yes. Stopped giving everything to people who couldn't or wouldn't give back. Mom and Dad had bandaged Ethan's wounds time and again, but mine, they'd let them scar over on their own. And Ethan, well, I hoped the rock bottom would push him toward help, like the support groups they have in Vegas for gamblers, but that wasn't my job anymore. The trust sits there now, solid and untouched in the bank, managed through that irrevocable setup my lawyer explained so clearly. It's waiting for whatever I decide, maybe a down payment on a place in New York or more trips like Miami. And me? I smile sometimes thinking back to that family meeting in Lincoln Park, how they laid out their plan like it was inevitable, how I sat there knowing I'd already drawn the line. They treated me like I was still the kid who wouldn't fight back, planning to take what wasn't theirs. But I watched them build their own trap and in the end, access denied. That's how it's staying.